Some towns keep secrets buried under silence, but silence cannot hold forever. In the shadows of a crumbling estate, where the walls still breathe with the cries of the forgotten, lies a truth so monstrous it was never meant to be uncovered. A family once whispered about in sermons and nightmares, bound not by love but by chains, blood, and ritual. And tonight, we will step into their darkness. A darkness that does not end when the candles burn out, but lingers in your mind long after the story is told. Part 6, Legacy and Lessons for Modern Warfare, 10 to 11 minutes, VO. Guadalcanal did not simply mark a turning point in World War II, it heralded a new era of warfare. The introduction of the M1 Garand was more than a technological advancement, it was a symbol that the speed of innovation could change the fate of nations overnight. Captain Nishimura's harrowing experience underscored a stark truth. Military strength was no longer measured only by bravery or numbers, but by the ability to harness technology and adapt rapidly. The Japanese reliance on bolt-action rifles, rooted deeply in tradition and training, was exposed as a fatal weakness against mechanized firepower. Around the world, militaries took note. The semi-automatic rifle became the benchmark for infantry weapons, reshaping arsenals and doctrines globally. Countries that embraced innovation outpaced those who clung to obsolete tactics and equipment. Modern warfare continues to evolve with technologies unimaginable to the soldiers of Guadalcanal: hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, autonomous drones. But the core lesson remains unchanged. Innovation isn't optional. It is essential. The price of failure is measured not just in casualties, but in strategic defeat. Veterans like Nishimura, who witnessed the battlefield's brutal transformation, carried those lessons forward, reminding future generations that no army can afford to ignore the relentless march of technology. The pop 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 of the Garand wasn't just a sound, it was the drumbeat of change that still resonates in today's conflicts. As military planners and strategists move forward, the Guadalcanal legacy stands as a warning and a guide. Wars can be won or lost by the surprise of new technologies. Those who adapt survive, those who do not perish. The House of Chains, it wasn't a home, it was a trap. And every door that opened inside led deeper into something no human should ever see. The Sullivan estate loomed before the men of Ashbourne like a beast crouched in the darkness. Its broken chimneys jutted into the night sky, and every cracked shutter seemed like a watching eye. For years, the villagers had passed this house and lowered their heads, muttering prayers, pretending its decay was only natural. But everyone knew it was more than just old wood and stone. It was a cage, a temple of pain. As the men stepped through the iron gates, the metal groaned like a warning. Lantern light wavered in the wind, and their rifles felt heavier than ever before. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary men being asked to walk into something their minds could barely understand. Inside, the air was thick, stale, almost wet. The wooden floors moaned under their boots, as if complaining about each intruder. The hall smelled of mold and iron, with faint undertones of smoke, as though fires had been lit and extinguished too many times. Dust swirled in the lantern beams, and the silence was broken only by the sound of chains clinking somewhere far below. The first room they entered was a parlor, furniture draped in sheets, portraits on the walls, faded but still watching. The paintings showed the Sullivans in their prime, stern faces, proud stares, children lined up like trophies. One of the men, Elijah, muttered, "God help us." Their eyes follow. And it was true, the painted faces seemed alive, smirking at the intrusion. They pushed deeper. Each door opened to something stranger. In the dining hall, a massive table stretched the length of the room, still set with plates. But the food was rotten, covered in mold and crawling with insects. And yet, there were signs it had been eaten. Gnawed bones, cracked and splintered, lay piled at the end of the table. The further they moved, the more the house resisted. Doors jammed, Windows refused to open. The lanterns sputtered as if the very air tried to smother their light. Then came the first sound, soft, almost gentle, a child's laugh, high-pitched, echoing from the upstairs corridor. But when the men turned their lanterns upward, the hall was empty. They forced themselves onward until they found the stairs that led down. The closer they came to the basement, the stronger the stench became: rot, urine, sweat, and blood. The wooden steps creaked under their boots, and some swore the boards flexed like ribs under pressure. When they reached the bottom, the door was locked. It took 3 men ramming their shoulders into it before the hinges gave way. The moment it opened, every lantern flame flickered violently, as if recoiling from what lay within. The basement stretched wide, with low ceilings and stone walls slick with moisture, and chained against those walls were children, dozens of them, thin, starving, skin pale as candle wax. Their eyes reflected the lantern light like those of trapped animals. Some reached out weakly, whispering for help. Others sat silently, their minds broken, their gazes vacant. The men froze. None of them had expected this, not in such scale, not in such cruelty. This was not rumor. This was horror carved into stone, and then movement in the corner. The Sullivan patriarch stepped forward, tall, skeletal, dressed in black. In one hand, he clutched a Bible, its leather cover worn from obsessive use. In the other, a whip, frayed at the end from too much practice. His voice was calm, yet carried across the cellar like thunder. You trespass in the Lord's sanctuary. These children are chosen. Their suffering is sacred. Their cries feed the covenant. Behind him, shapes emerged from the shadows, his sons and daughters, their faces gaunt, their eyes feverish. They moved not like people, but like predators circling the intruders. Some carried knives, others chains. Their mouths twisted into cruel smiles, as though they had been waiting for this intrusion. The townsmen raised their rifles, but hands trembled. These were Sullivan's, neighbors, kin by blood and history. To shoot was to shatter the illusion that Ashbourne was ever safe. That hesitation was all the cult needed. The Sullivan children lunged. The basement erupted in chaos, chains rattling, children screaming, men shouting. Lanterns toppled, their lights scattering in broken arcs across the stone floor. Shadows leapt wildly, and in the frenzy the rescuers realized the truth. The Sullivan house was not a home. It was a machine. Every room, every wall, every chain had been built for one purpose: to trap, to break, to sanctify pain. And once you stepped inside, the house did not let you leave. The children's cry. The chains were not the loudest thing in that cellar. It was the sound of children who had forgotten what hope feels like. The basement of the Sullivan estate was no longer silent. Once the intruders had broken through, the place awakened like a beast disturbed in its sleep. The crying of the children, weak but piercing, filled the stone chamber and wrapped itself around the men's hearts. Each whimper was a dagger. Each sob was a reminder that they were far too late. The rescuers scattered through the cellar, lanterns shaking in their hands as they tried to take in the sheer scale of the horror. Chains were bolted into the stone, each cuff rubbed raw with blood and skin. Some of the children were so small the chains looked like they swallowed their arms whole. Others were teenagers, skeletal but defiant, eyes burning with a fire that had not yet been extinguished. Elijah, the farmer who had led the raid, stepped forward and knelt before one of the children. A boy maybe 7 stared back at him, lips trembling. When Elijah whispered, "We'll take you home," the boy didn't respond. Instead, he shook his head violently, whispering, "No, no home. Home is chains." The words cut deeper than any blade. Before they could free a single child, the Sullivan patriarch's voice filled the room again. Calm, deliberate, terrifying. "Do you think you can undo what God has written? These children they are vessels. They suffer so that the town above can prosper. "Their torment keeps you safe," the townsmen shouted back, some raising their rifles higher, but their voices cracked. Because deep inside, many of them knew the truth. The disappearances had been whispered about for decades. Too many had chosen to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't their concern. The Sullivan patriarch was not lying entirely. Ashbourne had thrived in silence while the estate swallowed its victims. The Sullivan sons moved first. They darted from the shadows, pale and quick, their knives flashing in the lantern light. One of the rescuers fired his rifle, the blast deafening in the enclosed chamber. A Sullivan fell, but the others shrieked like animals and charged. The cellar erupted in chaos once more. Chains rattled violently as some of the older children, seeing the fight, tried to pull free. Their cries rose above the gunfire, desperate and raw.
"Help us! Please, don't leave!"
The sound became unbearable, echoing against stone until it felt like the walls themselves were screaming. One of the rescuers dropped his lantern in the struggle. The flame caught the straw on the floor, and smoke began to rise. Shadows twisted higher, and for a moment the room looked like hell itself. Flames, chains, screams,
and madness blending together. Elijah shouted for the men to cut the chain.
but the locks were too heavy, forged for permanence. The Sullivan daughters hissed like serpents, attacking with nails and teeth. They were not human in that moment. They were creatures bred by cruelty, raised in worship of pain. Amid the chaos, Lydia, the girl who had escaped days earlier and brought them here, appeared at the cellar door.
Her voice cut through the madness. The keys! They keep them in the altar!
The men turned and saw it, a crude altar of stone in the far corner, smeared with blood, stacked with bones. Upon it lay an iron ring of keys, blackened with rust. One of the rescuers dove for it, barely dodging a blade as a Sullivan lunged. His fingers closed around the keys, and for the first time, hope flared. One by one, they began unlocking the chains. Each lock opened with a groan, each freed child stumbling weakly into the rescuer's arms. But freeing them was slow, agonizingly slow, and the Sullivan family fought with the frenzy of demon. The patriarch stood in the center of the chaos, untouched, chanting scripture that twisted into madness. His words rose above the screams. "They suffer for you.
Their pain feeds the covenant.
Without them you will all rot." The children cried louder, their voices breaking the rhythm of his chant. And in that noise, in that storm of agony, something changed. The patriarch's face faltered just for a moment, because the power of his house had always relied on silence, and now silence was gone. The cellar had become a battlefield of faith, fear, and fury, and as more chains fell, the balance began to shift. The children's cry was no longer just pain. It was defiance. For the first time in decades, the Sullivan family was afraid, did not let you leave. Fire in the cellar. When fire touched the Sullivan house, it didn't just burn wood and stone. It awakened something that had been sleeping inside those walls for generations. The smoke thickened in the cellar, black fingers crawling across the ceiling. The flames from the dropped lantern had spread into the straw, licking up the walls and filling the chamber with the choking scent of ash. For the first time, the men realized they had not come simply to rescue the children. They had come to burn down the nightmare. Elijah coughed, pulling one child into his arms, then shouting for the others to keep unlocking the chains. The iron keys jangled in trembling hands, each turn of the lock seeming slower than the last. The Sullivan daughters shrieked as the smoke blinded them, their pale faces streaked with soot. Some retreated into the shadows, but others fought harder, desperate to keep their sanctuary intact. The Sullivan patriarch did not move. He stood at the center of the chaos, arms raised to the ceiling, chanting louder and louder. His voice blended with the roar of the fire, a sermon of madness. "The flames are holy! Let them consume the unworthy."
This house does not fall, it rises.
But the house was falling. The wooden beams groaned overhead. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Chains rattled violently as children coughed and gasped for air. Their weak voices screamed, "Help us!"
Don't leave us.
The men's hearts pounded. They had to move faster. One of the rescuers, Samuel, tore the altar apart with his bare hands, splintering the wood and scattering bones across the floor. Beneath it, he found more keys, hundreds of them, evidence of how long this had gone on. Keys to shackles that had held children who would never escape. Samuel fell to his knees, shaking, as the realization hit him. Not all who entered this cellar had lived to leave it. The fire surged higher. The children, still in chains, screamed in panic, struggling to breathe. Elijah and the others rushed from wall to wall, unlocking as many as they could, dragging the weak into the center of the room. But for every child freed, another Sullivan attacked. The cult did not give up. They clawed, bit, and struck with feral strength. Their devotion to pain was stronger than fear of death. Suddenly a loud crack split the air. One of the ceiling beams gave way, crashing into the stone floor and spraying embers across the chamber. Flames leapt upward, devouring the shelves, the ropes, the rotten wood. The heat grew unbearable, and in that moment of chaos, Lydia's voice rang out again, stronger than before. "The back tunnels! There are tunnels behind the wall." The rescuers turned. Along the far side of the cellar, behind a curtain of smoke, they saw it. A narrow archway, half collapsed but still open. A way out. They began herding the children toward it, coughing and stumbling through the thick smoke.
Every second mattered. Every breath burned.
Some of the children could barely walk, collapsing into the arms of their rescuers. Others cried in terror, refusing to leave, convinced that escape was impossible. The Sullivan sons tried to block the tunnel, snarling like cornered animals.
A gunshot rang out, echoing like thunder, and one of them fell.
Another lunged with a knife, but was struck down by a desperate swing of a lantern. The rescuers pushed forward, driven not by courage but by pure survival. The patriarch's voice still roared behind them, though now it was mixed with coughing, his words breaking apart. The covenant cannot be broken. The blood must continue. The pain must... His voice was swallowed by the collapse. Another beam gave way, and the flames roared with triumph. The Sullivan patriarch disappeared in the fire, his shadow flickering against the walls until it was gone. One by one, the rescuers and children stumbled into the tunnels, choking, blinded, clutching each other in the dark. The stone passage twisted beneath the estate, damp and narrow, but it led upward. Each step was agony, but each step was freedom. Behind them, the Sullivan house screamed. The fire ate through its walls, its beams, its history. For decades it had held secrets in silence. Now it howled as those secrets were set free. And when the survivors finally emerged into the night air,
gasping under the cold stars, they looked back and saw it, the Sullivan estate,
burning like a beacon of hell against the dark sky. Flames devoured the roof, windows exploded outward, and sparks rained like falling stars. The children clung to their rescuers, too weak to speak. The men collapsed in the dirt, staring at the inferno. They had survived, but survival was not victory, for the fire did not just destroy the house. It awakened something darker, something that would not die in the flames. The Sullivan family was gone. But their curse was not as afraid did not let you leave. The curse that would not die. You can burn a house, you can bury a family, but some things refuse to stay in the grave. The Sullivan estate was gone by dawn. All that remained were blackened beams and smouldering ash, the smell of smoke still clinging to the wind. Villagers gathered at a distance, their faces pale in the morning light. They had seen the fire from their homes, a tower of flame that seemed to stretch into the heavens, and they whispered among themselves, "The Sullivans are finished." But the survivors knew better. The children who had been rescued sat huddled in blankets near the church. Some stared at the ground, rocking back and forth silently.
Others cried without end, their throats raw.
And some did nothing at all, just empty eyes gazing into nothing, as if pieces of them had been left in that cellar forever. Elijah stood among them, his clothes torn, his face blackened with soot. He watched the flames die down, his rifle still in his hand. He felt no triumph, no relief,
Only guilt.
because he realized that this horror had not appeared overnight. It had been allowed to grow, fed by silence. Every man and woman in Ashbourne had known in their hearts that something was wrong in the Sullivan estate, but they had chosen to look away. Now the price of their silence was carved into the bodies of these children. As the villagers argued about what to do next, a sudden scream cut through the air. One of the boys who had been rescued began thrashing violently, pointing back toward the smouldering ruins. His voice cracked, but his words were clear. "They're not gone."
They're still inside.
The crowd froze. Some dismissed it as trauma, the boy reliving his nightmare. But then another child began to cry, whispering the same thing. "They're still here," watching us. That night, as the survivors tried to sleep in the church, strange things began to happen. Candles blew out without wind. Chains rattled in the rafters, though no one was there. And some of the children woke screaming, clawing at their arms as if the shackles were still burning their skin. The priest prayed. The mothers wept, but nothing silenced the echoes. Weeks passed. Ashbourne tried to move on. The ruins of the Sullivan estate were left untouched, a black scar on the edge of town. But hunters who ventured too close spoke of hearing whispers in the trees. Some claimed to see pale figures among the smoke-stained stones. And then, one by one, animals began disappearing. Goats, dogs, even a horse. Their bones, later found near the ruins, gnawed and broken. The townsfolk whispered that maybe the Sullivan family had not perished in the flames after all, that their faith, their covenant of pain, had bound them to the house itself. A curse born of blood and ritual, refusing to die. Elijah knew better than to deny it. He had seen the patriarch's eyes in that cellar, the madness burning brighter than the fire. He knew such a spirit would not vanish with smoke. It would linger, feeding on memory, on fear, on silence. And so Ashbourne became a town of whispers, once again. Parents still warned their children to stay away from the ruins. But this time, they did not speak of wild dogs or curses. They spoke of the Sullivan family, how their shadows still lingered, how their screams still echoed under the earth. The truth was simple. The fire had destroyed the walls, but not the evil. And some nights, when the moon was high and the wind carried just right, the people of Ashbourne swore they could still hear it. The sound of chains clinking in the dark, and children crying for help that would never come, because the Sullivan curse had not ended. It had only just begun. OT's afraid did not let you leave. Closing. The Sullivan estate may be nothing more than ash now, but evil does not burn so easily. The children saved that night grew older, but many never escaped the shadows of what they saw.
Some vanished.
Some took their own lives.
And the town of Ashbourne?
It still whispers. Whispers of chains that rattle when no one's there, of cries echoing through the ruins when the wind blows just right. Perhaps the fire destroyed the walls, but the darkness, the hunger, the curse of the Sullivans still waits. And if you ever find yourself near those ruins, remember, silence is not protection. It is an invitation.